Welcome back, everyone. This is Dave from Corman Productions, here to talk about Quantum Leap, Season 1, Episode 2, titled Star-Crossed. The episode description reads as follows. Sam leaps into the persona of a womanizing college professor in 1972, encounters his lost love, and attempts to reshape the past. The episode aired on March 31st, 1989. Before going any further, I will tell you two things. One, this is not a spoiler-free video, so if you have not yet watched this episode, please go and check it out and then come back and watch my video. Secondly, if you like this video and want to support the channel, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. My first video on this series did well enough, almost has 1,000 views, that it convinced me that it is worth continuing to look at this series and do videos on it. Part 2 of my look at Genesis did not do anywhere near as well, but was what I was hoping the first video would do in terms of views. And honestly, it didn't really deserve the love. It's an inferior video and was really the product of complete exhaustion. But I'm hoping to do better going forward, now that we're past the awkward first episode, which is always hard for me to do. Now that I don't feel the need to explain the series, we'll have a much easier time of this. This episode opens on a narration from Scott Bakula as Sam Beckett, explaining what happened in the first episode. Now, eventually, we would get to a point where we would have regular recaps of what the series is all about from Deborah Pratt. Deborah Pratt was married to then series creator Donald Bazzario, and she herself wore many hats on the series, including co-executive producer, the voice of Ziggy, and a guest spot on the series in which she was pretty terrible, but we will eventually get to that episode. In addition to that, she has plenty of writing credits and producing credits on the series. We really needed the explanation of the series, especially for newcomers, because when it comes down to it, the series concept is pretty bonkers. We would go through a few variations on this intro until we arrive at the one that they finally settled on, which was the Deborah Pratt version. After the credits, Sam leaps into the college professor in the middle of class, with a bunch of moon-eyed girls staring at him. Not a single guy is in this class. The girls are all looking at their professor with "I want you" eyes, which is my polite way of saying that. This is a family channel after all. And giggling as Sam bumbles around trying to get his bearings. Now, I've been to college. 2 of them, in fact. And I've even attended a few English literature classes. None of the girls in the class ever acted the way these girls are acting. This episode is set back in 1972, so maybe things were different back then. Or maybe this is a television convention that only happens in the movies or television and never in real life. Sam eventually discovers that they're reading the book Werther's Heights. Or rather, Wuthering Heights, which is a book written in 1847, written by Emily Bronte. That book is the tale of the troubled orphan Heathcliff and his doomed love for Catherine Earnshaw. Through Catherine's betrayal of Heathcliff and his bitter vengeance, their mythic passion haunts the next generation, even after their deaths. Well, that sounds quite heavy. Through narration, Sam Beckett reveals that he does not think very much of English lit. We hear some English literary references that I have no hope of getting, even though I'm a writer. I have never read any of these books that they are referencing. Eventually, Sam Beckett is saved by the bell. It's the end of class. So he doesn't have to continue BSing his way through this class. Sam wanders out onto the campus like a lost puppy, which he very much is like. And as he looks around campus, he thinks to check his wallet for his identification. And his name is Gerald Bryant, Professor Bryant. He's interrupted by Jamie Lee, one of his students who was just in the class, and who is kind of an annoying character, but then again, she's kind of supposed to be. She's played by Leslie S. Sachs, who has only 26 credits to her name, and her last acting credit is back in 2002, starring in a Lifetime movie. She's giving Sam the "I wanna do you" eyes, and she's acting all sorts of crazy, quoting literary quotes about love. And eventually Sam is like, "Hey, look, I'm a professor, you're a student, that means no fraternizing." But according to Jamie Lee, that's not what Dr. Bryant said last night. But right then, Sam Beckett spots Terry Hatcher. And well, that would definitely get my attention too. But Terry Hatcher is playing Donna Elise. She's famous for having played Lois on The New Adventures of Superman, as well as Desperate Housewives. And it is also interesting to note that one of Leslie S. Sachs' acting credits is on Terry Hatcher's series, The New Adventures of Superman. This is a very early role for Terry Hatcher, having only had 5 credits to her name, including an appearance on Star Trek The Next Generation. Sam tries to go after her, but Jamie Lee stops him and asks where he's going. And Sam says he's going to the same building that Donna is going to, though apparently they're closed at this time. And Sam says, well, she's going in, but that's because she works there. And then there's an awkward cut to Sam at home with Jamie Lee. It's pretty clear that Sam just wants away from her. Sam gets himself a glimpse in the mirror of what he looks like. And quite honestly, I don't know how this man gets so much attention from women. Jamie Lee goes on to say that she told her father about their relationship, and he was furious. And Oscar, her Neanderthal boyfriend, though she doesn't say boyfriend, wants to kill him as well. And as she talks, I'm as anxious to get rid of her as Sam is. And all of a sudden, Al is there, just sitting there. We don't see him come through the door, he's just suddenly there, staring at Sam and Jamie Lee like a creeper. Al's first appearance in this episode happens 7 minutes into it. I'm going to be keeping track of that as we go through the series, just for ha-has. Jamie Lee starts talking about Romeo and Juliet, and Al points out that Romeo and Juliet committed suicide. And Sam reacts to this out loud. And Sam tells her that that's not going to happen. Jamie Lee asks, well, what are we to do? And then we hear the buzzing sound of the water boiling, and Sam suggests tea. Well, that is definitely a much better idea than suicide. And Jamie Lee says that's exactly what Jane and Edward would do. I don't get the reference either. And this is apparently where this episode title comes from. Charlotte Bronte's Star-Crossed Lovers. Al asks him how he can teach English without knowing that. And of course the answer is, Sam doesn't teach English. Al tells him that they're going to get them out of this leap in a hurry. He goes on to say that there's a 99.5% chance, and he doesn't get to finish the sentence because Sam tells him that he doesn't want out of this one. And the reason, of course, is Donna Elise. He thinks he's here to right his own wrong, to give him and Donna a second chance at love. Jamie Lee comes back in with the tea, and Sam rushes her out the door, telling her to tell her father that it's all a joke, that he just wanted her attention. And Jamie Lee says that it isn't a joke. And Sam says, "Oh, but it is." Jamie Lee assumes that this is because of the pressure that the school is putting on him. And eventually, Sam just shoves her out the door, her acting as crazy as when she entered. Al tells him that the reason he's here, the 99.5% chance, is to make sure that they, Jamie Lee, and the professor do not get married, because it ruins their lives. And apparently, this was a shotgun wedding. But Al and Sam get into a little argument. Sam thinks he's there for Donna, and Al insists that he's here to make sure that the professor and Jamie Lee do not get married. And for the first time in the series, Sam says he doesn't give a damn what Ziggy says. He believes that he is here to get him and Donna together, or at least make it so she doesn't leave him at the altar. And nobody is going to stop him, including Al. Now let's talk about this for a minute, what Sam is actually trying to do here. Because this is pretty major history writing, at least personal rewriting of history. Because let's say Sam succeeds, and I know whether he does or not, because I've watched the series. But for the moment, let's assume that I don't know anything. Sam gets married. How does that alter his lifetime? Does it perhaps lead to Sam not getting into the quantum accelerator to leap to prove his theories before the project was shut down? Thus meaning he never leaps, doesn't save Tom Stratton and Peggy. Because a married man has a lot more to lose than a completely single one. And let's say for the sake of argument that they had kids together, which is a consequence of marriage. It could be a consequence of not being married and engaging in activities as well. But when you get married, kids often end up involved, giving him even more reason to not risk his life. So as a potential consequence for getting married, he might be making it so he never proves his theories on Quantum Leap. That is either something that Sam Beckett does not consider, or he did, and he just doesn't care. But let's say for a moment that Sam Beckett, even with a wife, still steps into the quantum accelerator. He's now potentially leaving his wife without a husband and his potential kids without a father. That is an astoundingly selfish act by Sam Beckett, and an early one in the series, who has a reputation, mostly given to him by Al, as being a Boy Scout. After commercial, Sam and Al are continuing to argue. Al is saying that Sam is breaking his own rule, that no time traveler is allowed to take advantage of his time traveling to alter his life in any way. He is not supposed to be taking advantage of time travel to improve his own life. And Sam seems incredulous that he came up with that rule. But Sam says he's the one who came up with the rule and he can rescind it. But Al tells him not without committee approval, and Weitzman will never get it, or give it, rather. Now, this is interesting because after a certain point, the show stops delving into the politics back at the project. It just stops talking about it. I believe that happens after the season premiere. I don't think we get into the specifics of what's going back at the project in the political arena after that. Weitzman apparently wants Sam declared non-compos mentos, which is a fancy way of saying that he wants to declare Sam insane. Sam is not impressed. Sam eventually realizes that there's a couple of co-eds observing him talking to himself, not for the first time, nor the last time in the series. he goes into the student lounge and grill where Donna works, and Al follows. As they enter the entrance, they end up in an area where the lighting is a little bit different, and as a result, Al ends up turning into a ghost-like figure, most likely because of the black lighting. Sam eventually ends up pointing out Donna, and Al is not happy. He clearly recognizes her, which brings up an interesting point. I'm not entirely sure how long Al and Sam have known each other, but this seems to indicate that Al has known Sam long enough for him to have met Donna. And in a little bit, Sam will reference their love affair happening 10 years from this point, which would put it in 1982. Apparently, Donna was part of the Starlight Project that Sam was also in, as well as Al. We never do learn what exactly that project was. Al is imploring him not to continue forth with what he's doing here, or what he's thinking about doing. But Sam ignores him and asks for his help, and Al responds by saying that he can't help him. He did so once before when he revealed Sam's last name, and if he does it again, the committee will remove him from the project. And eventually, Al just disappears. We don't see him leave, we don't hear the door open, nothing. He's just gone. Sam goes into the lounge and sits at a table that Donna is clearing. And he's just all acting kind of weird. Eventually, she asks him what he wants. And he takes it that she knows how he wants his burgers made as a sign. She knows who he is, but that's not quite possible because she hasn't met him yet. Also, she's seeing Dr. Bryant and not Sam Beckett, but this is Sam going head over heels, as he does from time to time. He starts trying to convince her that he is not what he looks like. She thinks that he is giving her a line and tells him to knock it off. That basically, in her polite, kind way, tells him that she is perfectly capable of getting an A in his class, just doing the work. Al keeps going, or rather Sam keeps going, trying to convince her that he is not really the professor, not the person that she knows. I really don't know what Sam is trying to do here, how he thinks this is going to help. As they get into a staring contest because Sam is trying to get her to look into his eyes to see somebody different, she eventually just says, "Please don't talk to me anymore," and walks away. He tries to call after her, but is interrupted by Oscar, Jamie Lee's boyfriend, played by Michael McGrady, who went on to have quite a nice career. I would say that he's still acting to this day, but he doesn't have any acting credits in 2020, which could have something to do with the coronavirus. Anyway, Oscar wants to break his face because of his involvement with Jamie Lee. Sam suggests that they talk man to man, and if Oscar doesn't like what he has to say, he could always break his face later. He goes on to try to advise Oscar on how he might win Jamie Lee over, and if you ask me, his advice should be to run far, far away. But that probably does not get him out of this particular situation without bleeding. Eventually, Sam suggests reading poetry, and this seems to satisfy Oscar for the moment. He'll give it a try, but if it doesn't work, he'll be back to break Sam's face. Later that night, Sam is watching television, and it's talking about politics, which is particularly relevant to what happens later in the episode. But we'll get there. Anyway, he's enjoying a quiet night, smoking his pipe, when who should join in but Jamie Lee through the window, acting like a nutcase, as she has so far throughout this entire episode. Al is there to comment about how he brought this upon himself because of the quote that he gave to Jamie Lee in their last encounter. Eventually, Sam convinces her to leave after a long time of this scene, telling her to give Oscar a chance because he might just start by reading poetry to her. She's out the door, and then Sam excitedly starts to talk to Al about Donna, but she comes back to the window and says giving Oscar a chance will not affect her love for him. Okay, Jamie Lee, you can go now. Bye, Jamie Lee. Please leave. Finally, she's gone. Sam excitedly tells Al that Donna knew how he liked his cheeseburger. She looked into his eyes and knew it was him. Okay, Sam isn't much better in this episode. He's just as nuts. Sam is now convinced that he can fix things, but he has to locate her father. And Al's like, no, this is not happening. But he needs Al's help. And he gives Al the puppy dog look. And eventually, Al succumbs. We end the scene with Al still saying no, but we get the impression that he's gonna do it anyway. We cut through Sam strutting through the college, smelling the smell of a Bunsen burner, and being annoyed that he is teaching English lit. He eventually stumbles upon a classroom where Donna Elise is, working on a formula on the blackboard. Eventually, Sam comes over into the classroom and solves the equation, I think. Donna is impressed, curious how a English lit professor would know how to do that. And Sam brings up that she just forgot a few things, like Hubble's constant and something else that I don't understand because I'm not really a physicist. And I have very little appreciation for physics myself. Eventually, they get into a conversation about time travel. And Sam asks her where she would go if she could. And she says, back to when she was 6 and 7. And Sam says, oh, right, that makes sense, right before your dad left. And she seems really upset that Sam knows this. Sam suggests that someone might have told her. But she says she never mentioned it to anybody, so that's impossible. And Sam eventually just says that it was just a guess. And Donna is trying to get away from him and insisting that he never talk to her again. Keep it strictly in the classroom. Sam calls after her and says that he has a string theory on time and would like her opinion. And they could talk in the library, a very public place. Personally, I have no idea why Donna is even continuing to talk to this person. If I were her, I would have been out the door and done everything I could to not talk to this man ever again. Maybe even drop out of his class. A restraining order, perhaps. But she agrees to do so. And then we have a montage of them talking and him explaining the string theory of his. Sam, you don't think this might have some consequences? You explaining away your theory? What happens in the future when you actually meet her and start explaining your theory to her? And she's like, oh yeah, I had a college professor that had a theory like that. Cripes, Sam. You're like a really dumb puppy in this episode. We catch the tail end of what he is saying to her. And he has to stop because Donna has to go to work. And Sam asks if they can continue it after work. And she says sure, as long as they are in a public place, which Sam ends up finishing that sentence for her. We hear Al's voice asking, hey, you're not giving away any trade secrets, are you? And it kind of seems like he is. Sam asks how long Al was there, and apparently it's long enough to know that Sam can still construct an atom bomb if he wanted to. Sam seems incredulous, but I kind of think he could. Al is wearing a weird white coat with a sash with Egyptian symbols on it. And apparently, he isn't alone. Weitzman and the committee are there. They can't hear Sam, but they can hear Al. Al tells him that he can't help him. And Sam says that he has to. He figured it out. Donna left him at the altar and did the same to the guy before him. And it all stems from her father abandoning him. If he can reconnect her with her father, then perhaps that would do the trick. Al points out that the 6 doctorates that Sam Beckett holds, not one of them is in psychiatry. And then he goes off to list a few, including ancient languages, which is relevant because of what's written on the sash. Al and Sam play a little game of charades, and eventually Sam realizes that her father is in Washington, but he still needs a name, and Al can't give it. But eventually, Ziggy has caught on to what Al is doing, and as he's dragged off by the committee, which is a really weird effect, by the way, just him sliding backwards, Al calls out her father's name, and now the final puzzle piece is in place, but we don't know what's going to happen to Al. Eventually, Donna comes back into the picture, and Sam asks her if she would go somewhere if she asked. And Donna's like, Dr. Bryant, please don't treat me like that. And Sam is saying, no, it's not like that. We just need to go to Washington, and I'll bring a chaperone. It's to save a lost love. And that is enough to convince her. It wouldn't be enough to convince me of anything, but I guess I'm not a 20-year-old girl. I happen to know that Sam Beckett has good intentions here, but Donna is completely clueless. And this guy has been acting bizarre all episode long, at least from her perspective. So why would she go anywhere with this man? I suppose the answer to that is so that the rest of the episode can actually happen. We cut to Donna's father, who is packing. And he gets a call from Sam about his daughter. And he thinks something might have happened to her. But oh no, nothing like that had happened. She just is never going to love again unless they meet up and repair the relationship. I have a question here, Sam. Why does her college professor care about Donna's love life? Your tactics in this episode are a little interesting to me. Anyway, this guy is about to ship off to Vietnam. And he will deal with this when he comes back. He doesn't want to open up the wound now. But then Sam asks, rather subtly, hey, what if you don't come back? Smooth, Sam. Smooth. Not surprising this tactic doesn't work. After the phone call, Sam Beckett hears a knock at the door. Thank God it's not Jamie Lee. But it's not any better, as it's Oscar to break his face. And he does so by punching him in the nose. Sam Beckett falls backwards, and commercial. Upon arriving back, apparently the poetry reading did not go well. And it's because Oscar was talking about being horny. And eventually, Sam asks, hey, do you have a car? And he suggests a road trip to fix both of their problems. He's going to bring Donna to Washington, and he's going to try and fix Jamie Lee and their relationship. And the car ride initially does not seem to be going well. She gets offended at Oscar hunting and shooting a buck because Bambi was a buck. And then Sam suggests that Romeo hunted. And Oscar does enough with that, to save things a little bit. They stop at a gas station where Sam runs into Al. and Sam is very happy to see Al because he thought he was a goner, and apparently he was. They fed the hieroglyphics into the computer, into Ziggy, and Al was fired. But he got his job back using underhanded tactics involving Tina. Oh, and by the way, I was really confused when I looked up at Internet Movie Database, and the woman at the beginning of Genesis was listed as Tina, wondering if they were the same person. And I looked it up, and apparently this was the case. But Sam knows Tina, and from the appearances in Genesis, it looks like Al and Tina are meeting for the first time. This could be either for two reasons. One, maybe it was just a retcon. Or two, perhaps that little scene at the beginning of the first episode is some really weird role play thing that Al and Tina are doing. Given the nature of Al's character, I guess that wouldn't surprise me overly much. Anyway, Al got his job back. And Al goes on to say that if Sam pulls off what he's trying to do here, then Donna will indeed end up marrying. The odds are pretty good according to Ziggy. And Sam seems excited. But Al points out that there's something that Sam is forgetting. That she almost married somebody before she met Sam. So she might end up marrying that guy before ever meeting Sam. Eventually, in the car, Donna asks him, or rather says that she used to think that he wrote his book to pick up girls. And then, after this little adventure, he realized that he really is a hopeless romantic. He's trying to fix Oscar and Jamie Lee for the sake of lost love. But she doesn't understand her part in things. And Sam simply says that she reminds me of his own lost love, 12 years younger, but her, and that the reason they're actually going to Washington is to meet her long-lost father. She seems stunned by this news. She looks out the window and says, "You really are a romantic." They get to the hotel, but they are stopped by the hotel desk, who says that the colonel has a do not disturb on his room, so she cannot be buzzed up, and she cannot prove that she is actually his daughter, which is the only way she would get up there. And so Sam and Donna leave the hotel, but of course Sam isn't done. Meanwhile, the hotel desk people, security I guess, are starting to get suspicious. They look out a window and see a car that was not there earlier, or something along those lines. Sam and Donna outside are just standing around for a moment, and Donna suggests that it might just not be meant to be. But Sam seems to have an inspiration and just starts walking along the hotel. What he's thinking, or how he even comes up with whatever he's doing here, is a mystery to me. Unless he somehow knows where he is, that he's at the Watergate Hotel, the date, and that there's going to be a break-in, so he's looking for the door that's broken into. But that's flatly discredited by Sam himself, who says he doesn't remember. And, oh, by the way, in this series, there was a thing that they talked about often when they talked about this series, and that was the kiss of history. Having Sam somehow become a little bit involved in history's events, such as the Watergate break-in in 1972 that ultimately resulted in Richard Nixon resigning. Sam eventually does find a door that is unlocked and goes upstairs to meet Donna's father. With Donna, of course. The security guard takes a closer look at the car that Sam arrived in and said that it has Ohio plates, which, oh, by the way, Sam mentioned that to you. He said that they drove from Ohio. So why is this surprising to you? But eventually, this leads them to realize that they have a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, and thus history is happening. Donna knocks on the door, and her dad opens, and they stare at each other. And Donna says, "This is a mistake," gets a little misty-eyed, and tries to leave. But her dad chases after her and says the mistake was not reaching out sooner. He tells her that he loves her, and they hug and they cry. Sam eventually starts to walk away, and Donna says not to leave. And this scene is a little bit odd because it's written like a goodbye. It's odd because it seems like Sam is just going to go wait in the car. As far as she's concerned, she's going back with him. Now Sam is soon going to be leaping out, but she doesn't know that. The scene is written for some closure, but it doesn't actually make any sense when you break it down because, like I said, Donna doesn't know that he's going to be going somewhere. And eventually, Sam makes his way down the staircase where he runs into Al, and he's dancing around like a goof. Al doesn't get him, saying that for all Sam knows, he could be marrying the other guy. And you know, Al, there's a way to check on that, like you do every other time in the history of the series. And I keep waiting for Al to mention the fact that he changed history for Oscar and Jamie Lee, saying that, 5 years from then, that they engage in a double suicide for love. But I'm just kidding. That doesn't happen. Al asks, why hasn't Sam leaped if he's achieved his mission? And Sam starts to say, after Oscar and Jamie Lee kiss, maybe they need a shotgun. And Sam leaps. He leaps into a boxing ring where he gets himself punched in the face. Hopefully this will knock some sense into him for this leap. And that is the episode. Now, I made fun of this quite a bit because, that's just how I do. But it is an enjoyable early episode in the series. Jamie Lee is absolutely an annoying character, but she's kind of supposed to be. Anyway, that's all I got for you for this video. If you like this video and want to support the channel, there are a number of ways to do so. You can follow me on Twitter at Core Productions. You can join my Corman Productions Facebook page. You can buy something from the Corman Productions store on Zazzle. You can buy me a coffee, which is a new way to support content creators such as myself. And of course, you can like, share, and comment on this video, as well as subscribing to my channel. This is Dave from Corman Productions, signing off.